Now I'm joined for his penultimate appearance by the cleverest young man in England, James Giles. James, so much to talk to you about and so little time. But let's start with the big story of the week. Why did the Tories choose to die on the hill named Owen Paterson?
Well, it's staggering, isn't it? And it's unfathomable as to quite why. There was a three-line whip. Tories marched up the hill by Boris Johnson, told if you don't support this man, you will lose your funding for your constituency parties, to only be left up the hill, Boris having done a runner, and been left looking like fools. Ultimately, there is a problem with parliamentary standards. Boris Johnson himself has been investigated more times in recent years than any other MP. But the Tories, in trying to do away with the Standards Commissioner, who they perceive as partisan, has conflated it with the issue of Owen Paterson. Instead of voting during peacetime, as it were, when one of their own wasn't under threat, they've decided to lump the two together. And as a result, fine, North Shropshire, they've got a very healthy majority. But in places like Old Bexley and Sidcup, where there are also going to be by-elections, this will have ramifications in those by-elections and also in the nationwide opinion polls. We're seeing a shift.
Did they plan this or stumble into it? Paterson's a man that's experienced tragedy. His wife committed suicide recently. Was there just a kind of spontaneous feeling in the Tory ranks that they needed to circle their wagons around this man? Or did they plan? Because I could make, if you gave me 20 minutes now, I could make a speech damning and denouncing the system of complaints and standards and privileges, which is unfit for purpose. But to do it, as you say, by conflating it with the Owen Paterson case, which looks to me from the outside as clear a case of wrongdoing as it's possible to imagine, and as lucrative as it is possible to imagine.
I mean, Owen Paterson was lobbying for Randox, who you and I have both used for our COVID testing, travelling abroad. They handed lucrative government contracts as a result of his lobbying. So for him to play the victim in all this and say, you know, he's been unfairly targeted, challenged, is frankly for the birds. But as for the Tories, they've got a problem here because ultimately what they should have done back in 2010 was enacted proper recall and actually had the Standards Commissioner, being the electorate, deciding whether or not they had confidence in their elected representatives. Because since the expenses scandal and since all of these ipsos have been set up to watch over MPs, instead of MPs thinking to themselves, morally, will my electorate put up with this? They're instead thinking, am I within the letter of the rules? Can I get away with it? And actually, it's time to put all of these quangos and all of these bodies, I think, to one side and actually hand the power back to who should be MPs' bosses, and that is the electorate.
Yeah, I signed, I'm on the face of the bill, Zach Goldsmith's bill for recall, which was to some extent gutted of much of its essence, but still exists so that, for example, if Owen Paterson hadn't resigned, we could be now out collecting signatures in his constituency of North Shropshire to force a by-election. At least we got that. But there should be total recall. An MP should be able to be recalled by their constituents at any time by gathering enough signatures to demand a by-election.
Oh, without doubt. And this is the lunacy of the rules. You've got Owen Paterson, who, yes, lobbied for a company to get lucrative government contracts, clearly did wrong, potentially facing, had he not have resigned, a recall petition. Meanwhile, you've got Claudia Webb, who's been sentenced and found guilty of harassment, including threatening to throw acid over a constituent's face, not facing recall while she goes through a lengthy appeals process. And you've got Rob Roberts, the MP for Delin, who around 6 months ago was found guilty of being a sex pest, sending inappropriate images and messages to one of his male staffers, who still sits in the House of Commons now.
He's just been readmitted into the Conservative Party.
To the Tory party, and faces no consequence whatsoever. And actually, all three of those things, if you were to put those cases to an ordinary voter, they'd look at being a sex pest, they'd look at throwing acid in someone's face or threatening to...
She didn't throw acid in anyone's face.
Throw acid in someone's face. And they'd look at lobbying to get millions of pounds of government money. And in all three cases, anyone in their right mind would surely look and say, there's something wrong here.
Now, you mentioned that North Shropshire is a very healthy Conservative majority, but that's partly because all the other parties split the opposition vote. What if a white knight in a white suit, like Martin Bell, can be agreed on by the other parties and stand as the anti-corruption candidate? Could that upset the apple cart? Is there any prospect of an agreement on that?
There isn't, partly because electoral law has changed since 1997 when Martin Bell caused that big upset in Tatton against Neil Hamilton. The way in which data now is regulated, I mean, everyone knows about GDPR, makes it far harder for parties to work together cross-party. But you've also got a wider problem there. Is, you know, if someone in a white suit did decide to enter the fray in North Shropshire and, you know, people are banding about names like Rory Stewart, which, you know, frankly won't appeal to a lot of Labour's voters and quite a few Lib Dems too. But this is your problem. You've got, let's say Labour and the Lib Dems did team up and say, right, we're going to put someone in there who's anti-corruption. They're likely to be a Remainer if they're supported by Labour and the Liberal Democrats. So let's say, you know, North Shropshire's a relatively elderly constituency. You've got a 70-year-old Tory voter, lifelong Tory, disgusted with what Owen Paterson's done, but a strong Brexiteer. What do? Do they back the Tories because they want Brexit, you know, seeing Brexit through, they believe in what Boris is doing? Or do they, to send a message about Owen Paterson, back someone who, apart from their position on SLEAZE, actually doesn't share any of their politics whatsoever?
Well, of course, there's not only SLEAZE in the Conservative Party. 7 Labour members of Parliament have been sent to prison over the last 12 years or so. SLEAZE cuts across party political boundaries, and that's before you talk about Tony Blair earning £100 million, about Peter Mandelson's life and times and so on. So the idea that SLEAZE is somehow just a Tory thing has just been, to some extent, gutted in Scotland also, where the publisher of the collected works of Nicola Sturgeon's book, Women Hold Up Half the Sky, the publisher has just been raided by the fraud squad because it got a huge sum in Scottish government money in what presumably is thought to be questionable circumstances. The whole British political system's pretty rotten, isn't it?
The whole political system is rotten. You've got a Labour Party that's thinking about bringing back Keith Vaz, the washing machine salesman, in Leicester East. You've got a Conservative Party that is going from scandal to scandal, yet still miraculously manages to stay ahead in the polls. You've got the Liberal Democrats who appear to have disappeared off the face of the earth, with the exception of Chesham and Amersham. And what could have been a massive moment for them very quickly fell by the wayside. And actually, quietly up the rear, you've got the Greens slowly making gains, regularly now overtaking the Liberal Democrats in the polls. Now, in an election atmosphere, that wouldn't actually translate into 9% vote for the Greens across the country.
No.
But what it does say is that the political system, in the eyes of more and more people, is broken, does need change, and people are looking, in a way, for a none-of-the-above option.
And does the Reform Party represent that in old Sidcup, Bexley and old Sidcup?
It could dent the Tories' majority in Old Bexley. And actually, I think Owen Paterson's issue will resonate more with voters there than it will in North Shropshire. Locally, Owen Paterson was quite well regarded as an MP. He did a lot around farming, a lot around rural broadband and boosting the town. And so even though people there think he's done wrong, they're still quite content voting Tory, or at least from the people that have been spoken to on broadcast media here in Britain. In Old Bexley, however, which is a marginal-ish seat, you know, seats have changed hands with a bigger majority than the Tories currently hold in Old Bexley and Sidcup. Richard Tice is putting forward a very energetic campaign. His slogan is "Send a message to Westminster."
He's the leader of the Reform Party.
Taking over from Nigel Farage. it's very unlikely that they'll win the seat. But if they can take 6 to 10% of the vote, that will send a very clear message to Tory backbenchers, increasingly uneasy with Boris Johnson's leadership. Up the mountain one day, down the next, U-turning left, right and centre, scandal after scandal. And these people, especially in the Red Wall, will start to think to themselves, if there's a 10% swing away from the Tories in Bexley, what does that mean for me?
I'd put money on Richard Tice getting between 5 and 10% of the vote. I don't know what the odds are on that. They need a result, don't they? They've been polling risibly badly in the elections that they have stood in, despite huge amounts of money being spent, much of it, I think, Richard Tice's own money. People like him and Lawrence Fox, what's the difference between them? Why don't they merge? Why don't they merge their finances and their electoral appeal? They are basically the same political animal.
Well, they are, and it's odd that those two entities haven't come together. They almost did in London back in May. You had Lawrence Fox standing for mayor, and in turn Lawrence backed the Reform London Assembly candidates, and they had a pact going on there. But really, this is a last chance saloon for Reform UK. They finished behind the Heritage Party in the Hartlepool by-election, and that's a party launched by former UKIP Assembly member David Curtin. Very anti-lockdown, again, very similar to the political territory that Reform and Reclaim occupy. But the Heritage Party, on no money at all, beat Reform in Hartlepool. And so if Reform have another disastrous showing in Old Bexley and Sidcup, we could find a similar situation to the SDP if you go back to Bootle, where they were defeated by the monster raving loonies of all people.
I remember it vividly.
And subsequently disbanded. And so if they don't pull something off here, people will begin to think that without Nigel Farage, they really are sinking ship.